December 19, 1944. The room was heavy with silence. In a small stone building near Verdun, senior Allied commanders gathered around a map that no one wanted to look at for too long. Red arrows cut deep into friendly territory. The neat Allied front line was gone, ripped open, bent inward, swollen like a wound. This was not how the war in Europe was supposed to look. Just 3 months earlier, victory had felt close. Paris was free. German armies were retreating. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas. Now Christmas was days away, and disaster had arrived instead. Dwight D. Eisenhower stood at the head of the table. Supreme commander. Calm by nature. But even he could not hide the urgency in his voice. German forces had launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. American units were cut off. Supply lines shattered. Entire divisions were fighting blind in snow and fog. At the center of the crisis was a small Belgian town most Americans had never heard of before. Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded there, cold, low on ammunition with no clear path out. German armor was tightening the ring. If Bastogne fell, the enemy would control the road network of the Ardennes. The Allied front could collapse in half. Eisenhower looked around the table. He needed answers. He needed speed. He needed someone who could move now, not tomorrow, not next week, but immediately. Then a voice broke the silence. It came from the far side of the room. Georges. Patton stood up. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He said calmly, almost casually, that he could attack in 48 hours. Not a limited action. Not a probing attack. A full-scale offensive. The room froze. Patton was proposing something no modern army had ever done, turning an entire field army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, under enemy pressure, and striking north into the heart of the German advance. Hundreds of thousands of men. Thousands of vehicles. Tanks, artillery, fuel convoys, supply columns, everything. In 48 hours. Some officers stared at him in disbelief. Others shook their heads. A few thought he was bluffing. This was Patton, after all, brilliant, aggressive, reckless. A man known for bold words. Eisenhower looked directly at him. George, he asked, how soon can you really attack? Patton did not look at the map. He did not ask for time to think. 48 hours, he said again. What no one else in that room yet knew was this. Patton was not improvising. He had already planned for this moment. While others believed the Germans were finished, Patton had assumed they would strike back. While others relaxed, his staff had prepared contingency plans for a sudden German offensive, plans that already existed, waiting in a folder. This was not confidence. It was preparation meeting crisis. Outside, snow fell across Europe. American soldiers shivered in foxholes. In Bastogne, wounded men froze as they waited for help that might never come. And now, in this quiet room, one impossible promise hung in the air. If Patton failed, the Ardennes could be lost. If he succeeded, the course of the war would change. The clock had already started. December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the forest came alive. In the Ardennes, thick with pine trees, narrow roads, and steep valleys, German artillery erupted without warning. The explosions shattered the quiet winter darkness. American soldiers woke to the sound of shells tearing through frozen ground and splintering trees above their heads. This was no local counterattack. It was everything Germany had left. Under the personal orders of Adolf Hitler, more than 200,000 German troops surged forward across a front nearly 80 miles wide. Elite panzer divisions led the way. Veterans hardened by years of war moved through terrain the Allies believed was too rough, too wooded, too frozen for a major assault. The Americans were caught completely off guard. Fog pressed down like a lid. Snow choked the roads. Air support, normally the Allies' greatest advantage, was grounded. Units lost contact with one another. Radios failed. Maps were outdated. Commanders did not know where their own men were, let alone the enemy. Within hours, German armor was punching through thinly held American lines. Entire regiments were overrun. Road junctions fell one by one. Fuel dumps burned, lighting up the forest with columns of black smoke that rose into the gray sky. The front began to bend. Then it bulged. That swelling, that deep penetration into Allied territory, would soon give the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. For the men on the ground, it felt less like a bulge, and more like collapse. Young American soldiers, many newly arrived from training camps, found themselves facing veteran German troops at point-blank range. In the snow-filled woods, visibility dropped to a few yards. Firefights erupted suddenly and ended just as fast. Confusion ruled. Orders arrived late or not at all. Some units fought until they ran out of ammunition. Others were surrounded and forced to surrender. A few simply disappeared into the forest, cut off and alone. At the center of this chaos lay a small Belgian town built around a simple fact. All the roads led through it. Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there, making it the key to movement across the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the battlefield. As German forces surged west, they closed in on the town from all sides. American units rushed in to defend it, not because it was prepared but because it had to be held. Among them was the 101st Airborne Division. They arrived in trucks, without winter clothing, without full supplies, without time. Paratroopers trained to drop from the sky now dug frozen foxholes with whatever tools they could find. The ground was so hard that picks sparked against ice. Within days the ring closed. German armor sealed the roads. Artillery pounded the perimeter. Snow fell constantly, soaking uniforms and freezing solid overnight. Medical supplies dwindled. Ammunition grew scarce. Wounded men lay on church floors and schoolrooms, wrapped in blankets that did little to stop the cold. Inside Bastogne, the question was no longer victory. It was survival. Outside the town, German commanders were confident. They believed the Americans were finished. A surrender demand was prepared. The logic was simple. Cut off, frozen, outgunned, surrounded. There was no escape. Back at Allied headquarters, reports came in piece by piece. Maps were updated with grim efficiency. Each hour brought worse news. The German attack was not slowing. It was accelerating. If Bastogne fell, the Germans could push on toward the Meuse River. Antwerp, vital to Allied supply, would be threatened. The entire Western Front could unravel. The Allies needed a response. Fast. Not a cautious plan. Not a gradual build-up. They needed a shock of their own. And somewhere to the south, an army was already turning its engines north, whether anyone believed it possible or not. George Patton was not like the other generals. Even among senior commanders he stood apart, sharp, demanding, impatient with weakness. Some admired him. Others feared him. A few openly disliked him. But no one doubted one thing. When Patton moved, things happened. He believed war was not chaos, but a brutal form of mathematics, speed multiplied by violence, directed by will. Hesitation in his mind killed more soldiers than bullets ever could. Long before December 1944, Patton had been thinking about disaster. While others believed Germany was finished, he did not. He studied Hitler's past campaigns and saw a pattern. When cornered, the enemy struck back with everything left in reserve. To Patton, the Ardennes was not a quiet sector. It was an invitation. So he prepared. Quietly. While his Third Army pushed east toward Germany, Patton ordered his staff to do something unusual. He told them to draft multiple plans, not for success but for emergency. One plan assumed a German attack in the north. Another assumed a breakthrough in the center. A third prepared for a rapid pivot if Allied forces were threatened. These plans were written, revised, and stored away. Most generals planned for what they hoped would happen. Patton planned for what could go wrong. He drilled his officers relentlessly. March discipline was enforced to the minute. Supply officers were pushed until they hated him. Traffic control, fuel movement, artillery coordination. Every detail was treated as life or death. Because Patton understood something few wanted to admit. Modern war was not decided only by courage or firepower. It was decided by logistics. An army that could move faster, turn faster, strike faster, would win. By December, his Third Army was one of the most aggressive and organized forces on the Western Front. Its commanders were used to sudden orders. Its soldiers were exhausted, but conditioned to act without hesitation. So when news of the German breakthrough arrived, Patton did not panic. He opened a folder. Inside were the plans. When he stood in Eisenhower's headquarters and promised an attack in 48 hours, it was not bravado. It was calculation. His staff already knew which divisions would turn north, which would hold the line, which roads would carry tanks, and which bridges could bear the weight. The challenge was not thinking. It was execution. Turning an army in peacetime was difficult. Turning one in war, under enemy pressure, through frozen roads with fuel shortages and exhausted men, was something no army doctrine truly covered. And Patton knew the risk. If the movement bogged down, his columns could be bombed, ambushed, or paralyzed. If the Germans reacted quickly, they could strike his exposed flank. If weather worsened, roads could become death traps of ice and wreckage. Failure would not just cost a battle. It could destroy an entire army. But Patton also knew this. Speed itself was a weapon. If he moved fast enough, the Germans would not believe what was happening until it was too late. Orders went out that same day. Divisions were told to prepare to move, not east but north. Staff officers worked through the night. Maps were redrawn. Timetables rewritten. Fuel priorities shifted. Soldiers were not told why. They were told only this: pack up. Move fast. Do not ask questions. As engines rumbled to life in the frozen darkness, Patton's gamble began to take shape. An army was about to attempt the impossible. And the clock was still ticking. The order moved faster than the snow. Across northeastern France and Luxembourg, engines coughed to life in the cold. Columns that had been pointed east now swung north, one by one, like a massive machine changing direction in the dark. Drivers leaned forward over steering wheels, peering through frost-covered windshields. Tank crews stamped their feet to keep blood moving. Artillery crews wrapped scarves around their faces until only their eyes were visible. The Third Army was turning. Roads never meant for this kind of traffic began to choke. Convoys stretched for miles. Jeeps, half-tracks, trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition, ambulances bouncing over ruts, tanks grinding forward at walking speed. Military police stood at intersections, waving traffic through in precise sequences. One mistake could jam the entire flow. Every minute mattered. Snow fell steadily, then harder. Ice formed on bridges. Vehicles slid into ditches and had to be dragged out. Engines froze overnight if not kept running. Men slept sitting up, helmets pulled low, rifles between their knees. Radio traffic exploded. Orders overlapped. Corrections followed corrections. Commanders improvised when routes became impassable. If a road was blocked, they found another. If a bridge collapsed, engineers worked through the night to repair it. If fuel ran low, tankers were rerouted without stopping the advance. There was no pause to reorganize. This was movement under pressure. German reconnaissance units began to notice something strange. American traffic was flowing north in unexpected volume. Not a retreat. Not a redeployment. An attack. But even German commanders struggled to believe what they were seeing. An army did not do this. Not in winter, not this fast, not while another major battle raged just miles away. Inside the columns, soldiers still did not know the full picture. They only knew they were moving toward the sound of the guns. Toward heavier snow. Toward something urgent. Some marched when vehicles broke down. Boots froze. Socks stiffened. Frostbite spread quietly, claiming fingers and toes without warning. Medics treated injuries on the roadside, then waved the men onward. No one complained. They had been trained for this pace. At headquarters, the clock was marked in hours. 36 hours left. The lead divisions began to angle toward the Ardennes, where narrow roads twisted through forests and hills. These were choke points, perfect places for ambush. German roadblocks appeared suddenly, forcing American units to deploy straight from the march. There was no time to dig in. They attacked immediately. Firefights erupted along the route. Tanks fired at muzzle flashes in the trees. Infantry advanced through knee-deep snow, breath steaming, weapons numbing in their hands. When resistance was crushed, the columns reformed and pushed on. Always north. 24 hours left. Fuel shortages threatened to halt entire formations. At one point, Tank units reported they had only hours of fuel remaining. Trucks were diverted at gunpoint if necessary. Supplies meant for other sectors were seized and rerouted. Nothing could be allowed to stop the momentum. Above them, the sky remained gray and hostile. Allied aircraft were still grounded by weather. There would be no air cover, no easy solution. This was war at ground level, cold, grinding, unforgiving. German commanders now realized the danger. They rushed reinforcements south, trying to seal off the roads leading to Bastogne. Panzer units moved to block the approach. Artillery was rushed forward to slow the American advance. But speed had already done its damage. American spearheads were closer than anyone expected. 18 hours left. Exhaustion set in. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and had to be shaken awake. Officers walked the columns, shouting encouragement, threatening punishment, doing whatever was necessary to keep men moving. Somewhere ahead, Bastogne was still holding. Somewhere ahead, men were freezing and bleeding, waiting for help that might arrive too late. 12 hours left. The lead armored units reached the outer defenses of the German ring around Bastogne. Resistance stiffened. The enemy knew what was at stake now. This would not be a race anymore. It would be a fight. But the impossible pivot was complete. An entire army had turned in winter, under fire, without stopping. What remained was the hardest part of all. Breaking through. Inside Bastogne, time moved differently. Days blurred together in a cycle of cold, hunger, and explosions. Snow covered the ground, then froze solid. Foxholes became ice pits. Men slept in short, broken moments, waking to the whistle of incoming shells or the crack of rifle fire at the perimeter. The 101st Airborne had no parachutes this time. They had arrived by truck, rushed straight into the fight. Many wore thin uniforms meant for autumn, not the deep winter of the Ardennes. Gloves were scarce. Boots froze stiff overnight. Fingers swelled, then went numb. The cold was everywhere. German artillery pounded the town day and night. Shells smashed into houses, churches, barns, anything that offered shelter. Buildings collapsed inward, trapping the wounded beneath rubble. Medics worked in cellars and basements, cutting away frozen clothing, using flashlights when power failed. Morphine ran low. Bandages were reused. Blood froze on the floor. The wounded did not cry out as much as they should have. Their lips were too cold to move. Food was rationed. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Machine gun crews were told to fire only when targets were certain. Artillery batteries saved shells for emergencies, knowing resupply might never come. Outside the perimeter, German armor lurked in the trees. Infantry probed constantly, testing for weakness. At night, flares lit the snow-covered fields, turning everything bright white for a few terrifying seconds. There was no safe place. On December 22, German envoys approached under a white flag. They carried a formal surrender demand, written in careful language. The message was clear. The Americans were surrounded. Resistance was hopeless. Continued fighting would only lead to unnecessary loss of life. Inside the town, senior officers gathered to consider the response. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the message once. Then he laughed. He thought it was a joke. When his staff explained that the Germans expected a written reply, McAuliffe considered his words carefully. He chose one. Nuts. The reply was typed up and delivered. The German officers were confused at first. When the meaning was explained, they understood. There would be no surrender. That single word spread quickly through Bastogne. It did not make the men warmer. It did not bring food or ammunition. But it did something just as important. It reminded them who they were. Paratroopers. They dug deeper. They shared what little they had. They fired back when attacked and held the line with stubborn, grinding resistance. Each road was defended. Each approach was contested. Still, the situation worsened. Casualties mounted. Wounded men lay exposed to the cold, blankets pulled tight around their shoulders. Some froze before they could be treated. Others whispered prayers, asking when help would come. The answer was always the same. Outside Bastogne, the sounds of battle crept closer. Distant artillery. The rumble of engines. German units shifted uneasily, sensing pressure from the south. The defenders did not know the details. They only knew that someone somewhere was fighting to reach them. Christmas came. There were no decorations, no celebrations, only the sound of guns and the cold. And then, on December 26th, something changed. The artillery fire to the south grew louder, not retreating but advancing. The men of the 101st listened carefully. They dared not hope. Because if relief did not come soon, Bastogne would not fall with a roar. It would go silent. On the morning of December 26th, the snow was stained dark by fresh tracks. South of Bastogne, American armor pushed forward under fire. The lead elements of the 4th Armored Division moved cautiously along icy roads, their engines growling, their crews scanning the tree line for flashes of movement. The Germans knew what was coming. They had thrown everything they could into blocking the approach: roadblocks of destroyed vehicles, hastily dug anti-tank positions, artillery firing point-blank down narrow lanes. Panzerfaust teams waited in the woods, hoping to catch American tanks at close range. The fighting was brutal and close. Infantry advanced ahead of the tanks, slipping and falling in the snow, rifles clenched tight. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees. Shells burst overhead, showering ice and dirt onto the men below. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Then the resistance cracked. A Sherman tank pushed through the final roadblock, its tracks grinding over debris. Another followed. And then another. At the edge of Bastogne, American infantry broke through the German line. Inside the town, the sound reached the defenders first. A deep, unmistakable rumble. Engines. Men froze in place listening. Then someone shouted, "Tanks?" From the southern road, the first American armor rolled into Bastogne. White stars appeared through the smoke and falling snow. The tanks moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the moment might not be real. Paratroopers ran toward them, waving their arms. Some laughed. Some cried openly. Others simply stood there, staring, too exhausted to react. The siege was broken. For the first time in days, supplies moved freely into the town. Ammunition, food, medical equipment. Stretchers replaced blankets. Wounded men were carried out instead of buried in cellars. But the relief was not clean or simple. Bodies lay frozen along the roads. Burned-out vehicles marked the cost of every mile gained. Medics worked without stopping, triaging men whose injuries had waited too long. There was no time to celebrate. German forces were still nearby. Artillery still fell. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. But Bastogne would not fall. Patton's promise had been kept. 48 hours had turned into a lifeline. Word spread quickly through Allied lines. What had seemed impossible just days earlier had happened. An army had turned, fought, and broken through in the worst conditions imaginable. For Patton there was no victory speech. He sent a short message of congratulations, then ordered his units to keep moving. The enemy was still strong. The winter was not finished. Inside Bastogne, the men of the 101st finally slept, some for the first time in days. They slept on floors, in trucks, against walls, wherever exhaustion claimed them. Outside the town the war rolled on. But something had changed. The German offensive had lost its momentum. The spearhead had been blunted. The gamble had paid off. The cost, however, was written in blood and ice, and it would not be forgotten. When the fighting finally slowed, the battlefield told the truth. The Ardennes was no longer just a forest. It was a graveyard. Snow covered broken tanks, shattered trees, and the frozen remains of men who would never move again. Foxholes were filled in. Roads were repaired. But the damage beneath the surface could not be erased. The Battle of the Bulge had been the bloodiest battle fought by American forces in the Second World War. Nearly 19,000 Americans were dead. Many more were wounded, missing, or captured. Frostbite alone claimed thousands of casualties, silent injuries that ended careers and lives without a single shot fired. German losses were even higher. Their final reserves had been spent. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel littered the countryside. Elite units that had once terrified Europe were broken beyond repair. Hitler's last great gamble had failed. With Bastogne held and the German advance halted, the initiative passed permanently to the Allies. The road into Germany reopened. The Western Front stabilized. From that point forward, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Yet the debate began almost immediately. Was Patton's decision genius, or reckless luck? Critics argued that the pivot exposed his army to unnecessary risk. A single major disruption could have caused disaster. Others pointed out that weather, German miscalculations, and sheer chance played roles no plan could control. Supporters countered with a simple fact. Patton had prepared when others had not. He had anticipated disaster. He had trained his army for speed. And when the moment came, he acted without hesitation while time still mattered. Leadership in war is often judged not by perfection, but by outcomes under pressure. For the soldiers who marched north, the argument was academic. They remembered the cold, the exhaustion, the friends who did not come back. They remembered how close failure had felt and how narrow the margin truly was. Bastogne became more than a town. It became a symbol of endurance, of stubborn resistance, of an army that refused to break. The men of the 101st Airborne would carry that memory for the rest of their lives. So would the tank crews, infantrymen, medics, engineers, and drivers who forced their way through winter roads to reach them. For Patton, the victory added to his legend, but also to his burden. He understood better than most that every success carried a cost paid by others. He had won a battle, but thousands had paid the price. As winter faded and the war moved east, the Ardennes slowly returned to silence. Snow melted. Grass grew. But beneath the soil, the echoes remained. The gamble had worked. The question was whether the price could ever truly be justified. Today the Ardennes is peaceful. The forest that once burned with gunfire now stands silent. Snow still falls here in winter, just as it did in 1944, settling gently on the hills and winding roads. To an untrained eye, it is hard to imagine that this calm landscape was once the center of one of the war's most desperate struggles. But the past has not disappeared. White crosses rise in perfect rows at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, marking the resting places of men who never left this frozen ground. Each name represents a life interrupted, dreams unfinished, families forever changed. The silence here is not empty. It is heavy. Among those graves lies a general. Not set apart. Not elevated above the others. George Patton asked to be buried beside the soldiers who fought under his command. In death as in war, he remained close to his men. His decision in December 1944 is still studied in military academies around the world. The maps are analyzed. The logistics are debated. The risks are measured and remeasured. Historians argue about alternatives, probabilities, and outcomes. But those discussions rarely capture the full truth. Because leadership is not only about planning. It is about choosing, when there is no perfect answer, when time is running out, and when failure means catastrophe. Patton chose speed over caution, action over delay, responsibility over safety. He understood that hesitation in that moment would have cost more lives than boldness ever could. And yet, he also understood the burden that came with that choice. Every order sent men forward into danger. Every mile gained was paid for by someone else. Victory did not erase the cost, it only gave it meaning. In Bastogne, the town rebuilt itself after the war. Streets were repaired. Houses restored. Life returned. But the memory of that winter never left. The words spoken in defiance, "nuts," became part of history not because it was clever, but because it reflected a refusal to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. That refusal echoed far beyond Bastogne. It echoed in the decisions made under pressure. In the soldiers who marched through snow without knowing if relief would come. In the commanders who trusted preparation over hope. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last gamble. Patton's turn was the answer. Not a miracle, not luck, but a reminder that preparation, courage, and decisive leadership can still shape events, even in the darkest winter of war. And as the Ardennes rests today beneath quiet skies, the ghosts of December 1944 remain where they fell, silent witnesses to an impossible promise that was kept.